I finished a roof, and actually we only need the same parts again. We don't need the whole roof, right? So I'm just going to delete a part of it. So let's say I don't need this half. Remove the faces, and I don't really need this part here either. But I'm going to have a little bit overlap here, just because I don't want that there is a weird kind of baking error going on for the normal. So this is our now detailed sort of roof, which is, in my opinion, a bit too crazy, but we'll see how this will look in the end. And you can also reduce this effect later on in the texture part. Right, so now all of our high poly modeling is finished, and what's left to do is baking this information into a normal map on our low poly model. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this part, and we're going to start baking. For baking the normal map, I usually work with not combining all the high poly information together, because sometimes you maybe only want to bake a certain part as a normal map because you need special settings or things like this. In this case, we will just use all the different mesh parts, but I just still would suggest you have like parts separated to each other, because you can use this maybe later on. Oh, actually, see, here I did a mistake because I want to apply this subsurf modifier. Then I'm going to join this. But also don't have too many parts because it's hard for keeping your overview. But in my case, I have like parts. I have the roof, I have my brick wall, and I have those windows details. And so I hope with those selected now, I can go and select. Actually, I have to make my low poly visible again because it was not visible for all this time. And I'm going to select my low poly last. So this is now my active element, right? If I go into edit modus, you can see this is my low poly. And now we're going to our bake settings here on our render settings. And in render settings, we go down to this bake settings. And here are a bunch of different options like ambient occlusion, normal, diffuse, and so on and so forth. We're going to use two of those options. We're going to use diffuse, and we're going to use the normal. The UV we can also export, but we'll export this in a different way. I will show you. Because the UV information is important for us for texturing to know where our stuff is located, right? So we need this UV as well. But back to the normal. If you go to normal, we have two options. We have objects, normal, and tangent normal. The tangent normal is going to be used for us to bake all those details that we've modeled to our low poly mesh. And the object normal we're also going to use is going to say if a face is which direction a face of our low poly mesh is facing, right? But first of all, we want to have the tangent normal. And something about the normal also is, normally when I start texturing, the normal is my base. Like when I started modeling or when I started texturing, normally what I would do in the past is I would start with making a diffuse map, and later on I would kind of add the normal or things like that. But that's actually, in my opinion, the wrong way to do it. It's much easier and much better to start from your normal map and then build all the other things around this normal map. So this normal map, in a way, is the most important baking map we are going to produce. And from this bake, we will also produce a lot of other maps as well. So actually I have forgotten, we need to create the texture first to bake to. So we're going to make a new texture, and we're going to call this bake house texture or something. And we're going to have a 1K texture in our case, because it's a very low poly model, and we're probably going to use this as an asset for a game, like Sample City Skylines or whatever. It doesn't really matter. You can use this for various different purposes, as I mentioned. So this 1K texture in our case will be enough. You can also, of course, bake 2K textures and later on make them to 1K textures, so forth. And now we also need to apply this texture that we created to our baking texture to assign this. And the way we do this is we have this material for our low poly mesh, and we're just going to add this texture here. We're going to choose it, bake house texture, but we're not going to assign this to our shader. We'll just have it here and active, and so now the program knows that it's going to bake to this texture, and we're going to see it here when it's done baking. And so back in our render settings, we want to select this selected to active, which means all our high poly objects we have selected, we want to bake to our active low poly model. And now we have to experiment with this ray distance. Normally I try a range of 0.1 and then I either go up or downwards depending on what the result will be. And so now we can probably first save this, and then we can start baking. Alright, so here's our result of this baking process of the normal map, and looking at it, I am pretty happy with the result. Some stuff isn't the way I want it to be. For example, there are some mistakes it did. It created, for example, this orange part here. We will probably have to correct a lot of this manually in the texture itself using Photoshop or another 2D software. In our case, we will use Photoshop, but you can also use programs like GIMP. Pretty fine, like the handle is good, the windows generally look fine. Basically, as long as you have this bluish and pinkish colors like here, it is correct. Your bake is correct. Now what we also can see is that the normal information on our roof is extremely strong. So there will be a lot of probably we have to make this a little bit less intensive later on, but we can do this using our textures. But I probably will rebake some of this stuff because I think I forgot to have those details here included in my mesh. Alright, and what you can see is that this orange stuff here has become less, which is fine. So we could actually try to further reduce this, but I am quite happy with the result. There's some stuff we need to fix like this and like this, but honestly it's really small things. Like, I'm really happy that this turned out good, and I think we can use this normal map pretty well. So I'm going to save this, and because I've already done this once and it crashed, I have to redo this, and I'm going to just overwrite this texture, and I'm going to call it house tutorial normal, and I'm going to save it as a Targa file, because Targa is a file that normally doesn't have that big of a compression, so you can keep a lot of your information. You could also use Targa raw, but Targa in my case will be fine. Targa or TIFF is pretty okay for those cases. And we're going to overwrite this. Alright, so what we want to do next is maybe look at why we assigned all those colors to this mesh, right? Because there is a reason for this, and I'm going to show you. We're going to bake those colors as well to our low poly mesh. So we already have a base of textures or of a material color that we can start out from. And the way we do this is we're again selecting all our... Oh, actually we forgot to bake this. Ha! We'll have to, I'll have to redo this afterwards. But right now let's focus on, because the process will be the same, let's focus on baking all of our high polys to our low polys. So the same thing again, we're just going to select all the high poly and we're going to select the low poly last. And now we're going to bake this diffuse color here. And we don't want the lighting to have any role. You can also experiment with getting also lighting set up and baking this information as well, but honestly I would do this in texturing and not so much with Blender. So we're just going to bake the colors. And the ray distance, I think we'll just leave it as it was. And we'll see what the result will be. Alright, so it finished. And I can already see some mistakes it has made. For example, you can see that here it's very confused about is this roof or is this brick texture. And so it's not perfect, but what is important is that those details here are baked correctly. So my windows, colors, my other stuff, it all looks good. And this stuff I can correct with my 2D program. You could also just play with this ray distance to maybe make it perfect. So let's say 0.004 and let's see what it will do. Alright, and what we can see is it became a bit better. It has still those issues, but honestly it's totally fine. So we're going to save this as our material ID. You can call it whatever you want. You can also call it diffuse texture depending on how you choose to work with this. But actually it's a very powerful tool because you have basic color information about your mesh already, and you can use those colors also as masks to create different variations of colors or details for your mesh. Some stuff is still missing. For example, we don't have yet our ambient occlusion map and we don't have our object normal. And actually the ambient occlusion, I will use my normal map to create this in the 2D program, and I won't use Blender for that. But you can also use Blender. For me, Blender sometimes just the ambient occlusion it produces doesn't look that nice, and I haven't yet found really the perfect settings to produce a really nice looking ambient occlusion map for different objects. So that's why I rely on my normal map to do this for me. So, but what we can bake is going to be the object normal, and that's what we're going to do now. So I'm going to choose normal and I'm going to choose the object normal. I think I can now deselect the selected to active, because now we only want to bake the object normal information from this very simple mesh. You could also bake the object normal information from the high poly mesh. I'll actually probably try to do this, but normally this will suffice. So this will actually take only a very short while to render. Yes, here we go. So this is our object normal, and what the colors indicate is the angle of the faces in relation to the world, right? So why would we use this map? Or for what stuff could you use this map? For example, let's say you have a roof, right? Like this. You have your house here. And maybe you want to have your house in the winter. You want to simulate how snow would fall on your house. So with this information, you can pretty easily do this because you know that this turquoise color here will indicate those faces that are on top on your roof, and those as well. And so you can basically use those color informations to create masks that can then be used to create different textures. And I hope I will talk in the last part of my tutorial about how we're going to use this, and I'll actually show you. So let's save this as well. Object normal. Something that's important to know, the workflow I'm trying to show you here is also a workflow that you use in programs like Quixel and Substance Designer, Substance Painter quite often. All those textures that we're baking right now or producing later on are textures that those programs also use as input to create really cool looking textures, and it will help you a lot in doing that. Alright, so I think now we have nearly all the textures we need, and I'm going to export the UV as well. So I'm just going into edit mode. I select all my UVs here on the low poly mesh. I'm going to UVs and I'm going to export UV layout. And we're going to save this here. House tutorial UV. I'm going to actually export this as a PNG, and it has also an opacity which I kind of like. You could also not use this, but I like the default settings for my UV layout. So the last thing I'm going to bake that actually is maybe useful is not going to be the ambient occlusion of all the other meshes overlapping this, but it's just going to be the ambient occlusion of our low poly mesh. And for that I will disable all my high poly stuff in the viewport and in the rendering. Especially in the rendering is important because there you will see it. And so now let me bake this ambient occlusion of this house. Perfect. I'm going to save this as house tutorial AO low. So anyways, I think that's the part done with how we model and how we bake maps from within Blender, so we can use it for our low poly model. And the next part is going to be how we are going to texture our model. And I hope to also see you then, and bye.